So while the city of Detroit is known for a great number of positive things, including the automobile, the big three American auto companies, Motown and the Fox Theater, the Red Wings, the city is also known for a great number of negative things. One of which is it holds the record for race riots. And accordingly, the city of Detroit has had the federal government come out to put down a race riot 4 times: 1883, 1863, 1943, and 1967. Accordingly, the issue of race in Detroit is a systemic issue, and it is pervasive throughout its history. So in the not too recent past, in the 1970s, there was a police unit known as STRESS. STRESS stood for Stop the Robberies and Enjoy Safe Streets. However, STRESS terrorized the Detroit community with military-style tactics, and over the course of the program were accused and convicted of executing several black males execution style, placing witnesses in deplorable conditions, and overall exhibiting a level of police brutality unbecoming of ethical officers. However, in 1973, with the election of Detroit's first African-American mayor, you see major changes taking place within the police department. 2 things that took place immediately were the dissolving of the STRESS unit, as well as the integrating of the police force. However, Coleman Young's administration, at least as it's concerned with appointments made to the police department, was embarrassed by problems coming out with corruption. However, this is something that is not isolated to the Young administration, and actually something that is pervasive in other mayor administrations and city government employees related to the police department, going through William Hunt, Stanley Knox, Isaiah McKinnon, Benny Napoleon, and so forth. Along with the story of police brutality, you can look at the very famous incident of Rodney King in 1992, where a black male was pulled out of a car and beaten by several white police officers. This was captured on the camera mounted on the police dashboard and gained international notoriety. So at this point, it should be pretty clear that the problem that I am looking at is the problem of violence in the police department that is disproportionately directed towards minorities. So looking at issues of police brutality, as well as how police, particularly the Detroit Police Department, tends to treat citizens of the city like enemy combatants as opposed to tax-paying citizens. So the goal of this analysis then is to bring down the level of violence and police brutality overall, but as well try to control for and reduce any effects due to racism, racial bias, or racial prejudice. This type of work has been going on with the Detroit Coalition Against Police Brutality for several decades, and they are the authority in the city in terms of research and statistics and data related to similar questions. So in looking to evaluate different policy options given this problem, I have set up some evaluation criteria. Number one is cost. Number two is whether or not the policy is race neutral or will at least have race neutral outcomes. Number three is the political feasibility. And number four deals with violence. So the policy options, there are three that I'm going to discuss. The first option would be increasing police regulations. The second option would be requiring cameras for uniformed police officers. And the third policy option would be the status quo, which is a current police policy of stop and frisk. The first option would be to increase police regulations. These regulations would be specific to regulating police officers themselves and their behavior. Police officers that were found to be using brutal force would be penalized, fined, and even criminally charged if the situation warranted. This would also provide for swift punishments for police officers that were involved in covering up the actions of fellow police officers. While the phenomenon of no snitching is a problem for law enforcement when dealing in communities that are plagued by crime, communities that are plagued by crime are also plagued by a no snitching rule amongst police officers. Oftentimes, police officers will cover for each other or will choose to plead the fifth. Their police union, the Fraternal Order of Police, operates on a very similar no snitching policy as the low-income minority communities that they police. The second option would be to require police officers to wear cameras on their uniforms to observe their behavior. This has been tried in locations in California and thus far has been empirically documented as a success. The third option would be to leave the status quo in place. Right now, there is a policy known as stop and frisk, which the Detroit Police Department says is race neutral. In fact, they say that if somebody has nothing to hide and is not acting suspiciously, that they will not be stopped. Police Captain Chief Craig assures the public that stop and frisk is just good police work based on solid criminology, and at the end of the day is not racially prejudicial and is not racially profiling. So when you look at the evaluation scorecard, I evaluated each of the policy options given the four criteria. If we look at the option for increasing police regulations, I put that at a cost of good. Good getting a point total of 2. The point totals work as 1 being the worst, 2 being good, and 3 being the best. So for cost, the increased police regulations get a rating of good. This is because it will not require too much extra allocation of resources to increase police regulations. However, there will be some cost involved in any prosecuting efforts that need to happen, and things related to enforcing these new regulations. But overall, this will not be a very high cost, so it gets a good rating. In terms of being race neutral, this also gets a good rating because officers that are involved in this will be more than likely punished for acting in non-race neutral fashions, and this should have a good outcome for people across the board. So it gets a good rating. However, for political feasibility, this gets a worst rating because the police department here in Detroit has already been under a federal consent decree since the early 2000s, meaning that they have a federal monitor that is sent down from the Department of Justice to oversee some of the actions of the police department given their history of brutality. As a result, and having been under a consent decree now for over 10 years, the department is within 90% compliance and is working very diligently and very hard to fully comply. As a result, any further regulations would be very politically difficult to get past the current police force, the police union, and as well some of the legislatures. So that's why it gets a rating of worst. And for violence, it's going to get a rating of good, and the reason I say it's going to get a rating of good is because the policy of increasing police regulations will hopefully act as an incentive to stop this type of bad behavior. However, it is more reactive than it is proactive and is not doing anything to stem necessarily violence as we're seeing it currently unfold. The second option would be to require police officers to wear a camera on their lapel. I say that this is a cost of good. It is a marginal cost. It's going to be a few $100s for the camera equipment and for the monitoring. However, while those costs could actually be a little bit higher, the pilot studies of this that have gone on have shown that use of force rates have dropped substantially, and of more importance to the cost factor is that lawsuits against the city have dropped, saving the city lots of money. So at the end of the day, while the new equipment may cost some money, you will have a lot of cost savings by not getting sued as much. So the police officers wearing cameras gets a rating of good. In terms of race neutral, the camera never lies, and I put this as the best option because if a police officer is outfitted with a camera, it will be possible to see what the circumstances were regarding the arrest and seeing if there was any differential treatment. For political feasibility, I also rated this as the best option because this is something that is currently being piloted by the Detroit Police Department and it passed political muster in reality. Finally, in terms of violence, I also rated this as the best policy because the pilot studies thus far have shown that it has significantly reduced the amount of force used by police officers in their day-to-day interactions. Finally, there is the status quo, which is the policy of stop and frisk. In terms of cost, it gets the best rating because it would not require any policy change and nothing more or less would have to happen, keeping costs where they are now, so I put that at best. In terms of race neutral, I put that at the worst. Empirical studies thus far have shown that stop and frisk is disproportionately enforced upon minority black men. Political feasibility I did put down as the best because it has already passed political hurdles and is already in effect. You do not have to look too hard at political feasibility because it's already made it. It is in fact politically feasibility. In terms of violence, I did rate this as the worst one because tactics of stop and frisk Finally, with the scores of 1.75 for increased police regulation option 1, score of 2.8 for option 2 requiring cameras, and an option 3 receiving a 1.9 score, my final policy solution and my recommendation and my choice is option number 2 coming in at 2.8 points, and that is requiring cameras for uniformed police officers.